Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Budget 2023 discussion. During this hour, we'll be discussing the effects of the measures which were announced during yesterday's budget speech. Joined today, I have Andre, who is a co-host together with myself. One housekeeping rule before we get started. If you do have any questions, please feel free to log them into the comment section, and we'll be picking them up as we go along. I'd like to introduce our panel of speakers. So we have Michael Bianchi, Konrad Casarto-Reggiani, Rafael Aloisio, Caroline Casareno, and Ludwig Mikalev. We'll get started. Andre, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. Would like to thank those of you who have joined us on Facebook Live this morning. Budget 2023. Budget 2023 was written in a specific context, in an international context which is being impacted by the Ukrainian conflict, by energy cost increases, spiraling inflation on an international context, and so many other challenges. Let's not forget, we are still coming out from a COVID pandemic, which had, of course, had its impacts on our economy. And, of course, the previous supply chain disruptions that were impacting the economy as a whole. And if you see the social partners, for example, initial reactions from yesterday, many came out saying that this budget was a budget of continuity, a budget of stability. And here I would like to immediately bring in Rafael Aloisio for his initial take on the macroeconomic situation and the outlook of the Maltese economy. Rafael.
Good morning, everybody. Following up on Andre's introduction, I think it is very clear that the budget, one of the primary drivers was to not to take any radical, fast changes, to actually keep a steady as she goes model. I think obviously when faced with the sort of the challenges, the global challenges that all countries are facing, spiraling fuel costs, pressures on resources, inflation. Obviously, I think many countries have actually tried to take a very, let's call it, an approach which is trying to really take economic, fiscal measures to try to sort of address these issues. I think the budget in Malta, I think, was focused on not making any sharp changes, not making any radical changes, to continue to maintain sort of the employment levels, to actually do everything to try to maintain the level of consumption by giving extra focus on the more vulnerable, be them lower income earners, pensioners. So I think in this respect, I think the objective of stability is clearly a dominant feature that comes out over there. I think one needs to look at in the sort of the overall budget measures in the context of where Malta is today compared to 2019, which is often used as the benchmark. Having a high-level review of the numbers would actually shows, I think, an increase in revenue of close to 900 million between 2019 and 2022. By all counts, I think a commendable achievement, especially when economic level of activities are still below what they were in 2019, and also in a situation where level of taxes were not increased. Against that, we also have obviously a very significant counter pressure, which is on expenditure. Levels of expenditure between 2019 and 2022 have shot up. We're talking about 1.7 billion increase over the recurrent expenditure by 1.7 billion, capital expenditure by 200 million. Basically, there is a actually increase in the deficit or the shortfall of 1 billion, of which 600 million has actually been apportioned for to mitigate the costs of rising fuel costs. So at the end of the day, when one looks at the overall position, I think certain fundamental dynamics of the economic performance at government level seem to be strong, in that despite maybe looking at the bottom line and looking at the deficit, which is clearly a challenge, okay, and obviously moving forward, although within the 60% criteria, obviously with debt servicing obligations increasing, will be a challenge. However, we also have a situation that there's been, between 2019 and today, significant increases also in health expenditure, in social services, in education, a number of those areas, which obviously over time need to sort of be compensated by increases in revenue.
If I may, Rafel, taking you on the subject of debt servicing and debt to GDP ratio. You specifically mentioned, and the government is forecasting, that will remain within the 60% bracket according to the convergence criteria. Do you feel that in the medium to long term, that will have eventually an impact in terms of maneuverability when it comes to the government's potential to keep on investing, for example, in terms of subsidizing energy rates, even potentially eventually expanding on capital investment and capital expenditure? What's your take on that?
Obviously, the energy subsidy, which is a major part of the capital expenditure, is a contributor, because when you talk about it's accounting for 10% of the total government spend. So that is an factor, and obviously the way fuel prices will sort of evolve over the coming years is going to be a factor which could possibly give a bit of elbow room if there is a normalization over time. We also have a situation, obviously, that capital expenditure has been sustained, and obviously you have a situation where other countries, okay, we can look at those who are better than us, but we also know that other countries are in a far worse position than us. So I do believe that in extraordinary times that the world is going through at the moment, I think there will be, for the next 2 years, I think, an element of elbow room, for people to sort of, for countries to manage their economic direction, in a way which is most appropriate to the circumstances. Each country has a different dynamics, and I think Malta does have certain different dynamics. I think what is key, Andre, I think will be what level of success we achieve in creating new economic drivers over the next 24 to 36 months. Clearly, there are mention of a number of areas, which the other panel speakers will talk about later, but I think the fundamental challenge is going to be, are we going to be able to create new economic drivers which reflect the realities of the future?
Absolutely. Of course, the budget is a fiscal exercise, and here I want to bring in our tax experts. Conrad, of course, there were no surprises in this budget. The Minister of Finance had mentioned previously that there will be no tax hikes, no tax increases, etc. What was your take in terms of the proposals and recommendations made in this budget in terms of the fiscal part?
Thanks, Andrea, and morning, everyone. I think what's interesting about this particular budget when it comes to tax is really what we're not seeing. So yes, if we go back a little bit in the year to March, there was talk about reform. There was talk about reform being driven by pressures at a global and European level. Around the beginning of summer, July, the language had already started to change, and we were being indicated that maybe that was something on the back burner, and maybe things were not moving with the same pace, and that communication has been reinforced. So we didn't expect anything major, like a move to a classical system in the budget. That was clear. But what's interesting is how little tax is being put front and center as part of the plans and the way forward. And I think it's interesting to note that when you look at the budget itself, it has very few specific tax measures. Now, the fact that there was also an electoral promise around reduction in the effective tax rate, that was directly addressed by the minister in his speech. And references were made to the UK and the catastrophic effects of what was referred to as irresponsible reduction in taxation was mentioned. And also the fact that today, with tightening monetary policy at an ECB level, doing something radical around taxation at a local level in the form of reduction of tax burden, etc., would have been maybe seen as conflicting messaging. So I think that's the backdrop. There was an express point made as well, is that we could have reduced taxes, maybe that would have come in at, 500 odd euros per family, but it seems like the decision has been we'd rather collect the taxes and use it to protect the vulnerable, to protect the economy against these shocks, which Rafa mentioned, and try to ensure the continuity. So I think here government taking on more of a role of, I know how better to use that money rather than just reducing your tax cost. And of course there is a differential because we're talking about almost 4 times the amount in quantification of the net benefit that has gone in, because I think it's been calculated that the subsidizing of fuel prices is coming in at about €2,000 per family. So I think that's very important. When you look at the actual incentives, what the minister refers to is that we have very focused credits and incentives to where we feel they are really required, but they're targeted, but there are few. At a technical level, we're talking about continuation of tax credits for businesses in GOZO and startups on qualifying expenditure, up to a 10% tax of the expenditure and tax credit, potentially doubling to 20% if that investment now is in an area around reduction of carbon footprint. There are some technical measures around capital allowances for COVID-impacted businesses, so unabsorbed capital allowances. And of course, the tax refunds are back, and there is an increase in the rebates on sports. But what I found most interesting in the taxation area is not so much the measures, but one was the clear recognition, and there was almost a tipping of the hat to the Commissioner for Revenue on an estimated 120 million additional revenue through better enforcement. And that was, the component net of the growth in the economy. So that is purely additional revenues which are coming from that additional enforcement. And a very strong message I found through, especially towards the end of the budget, around the focus. I mean, we often find in budget speech a reference to fiscal morality, but this seems like a much more focused attention towards saying, look, we're going to improve our judicial processes, also within the criminal law area, but that also has a knock-on to certain areas of taxation if we're looking at the more aggressive types of abuses in the form of tax fraud, and clearly a strong message around giving the resources required to maintain the levels of governance around financial crime in the areas we have achieved as part of the removal from the grey list, a strong message around maintaining those standards, so we're not expecting to see a relaxation of that approach. And we're talking about investment at the Inland Revenue Department level, the FIU, the MFSA, the MBR, and of course law enforcement. So I think that shows that the focus around compliance, and of course while you're targeting the more sinister and the more malevolent elements within society, once you've strengthened the whole net, then the level of compliance, even on what are maybe less significant but still non-compliant activities, we expect, as we have seen with this 120 million in collection, we expect the bar to be raised. And I do think that that's all part of where the projected, I'm not saying it's solely coming from that, but when you look at the projections, the financial projections, we're seeing between 2022 and 2025 almost $1 billion increase projected in revenues. Now, off the back of no new taxes, that's quite a significant increase. We go from, I think 5.3 to 6.4. So $1 billion on a base of 5 billion is quite a significant number. And I think a lot of that will also, not exclusively, but come from, of course, economic growth, but also increased compliance. We also see, an investment in asset recovery, with the strengthening of premises, specially designed purposes to assist the Asset Recovery Bureau. And I think that's all part of a shift in culture. So I think that's more about that in this project than it is about fiscal measures per se.
Conrad, moving a bit slightly away from the tax subject and maybe shifting a bit toward what Rafael mentioned earlier in terms of the new niche and new segments being proposed in this budget. What was your take on the matter?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting and exciting part of where we're going. So there is a part of the budget speech which looks to me like a declaration of a vision, to build on the businesses which have delivered and to create, through innovation, a culture of innovation, niche opportunities for new economic sectors which are sustainable. I think that's a very important messaging around where the vision is going. Which are the areas which have performed better than expected? Clearly, tourism was singled out. Strong performance in exportation of services with both technology, gaming, and professional services. So that's, again, a strong message as to what has succeeded. And also a shout out, so to speak, to certain manufacturing, which has performed beyond. So I think that's very interesting around what's really worked. So we can imagine focus there. But then this culture of innovation. And I think one of the most interesting part is clearly this startup vision. So establishing Malta as a startup capital, so to speak, within Europe. Of course, clearly some other jurisdictions have done that, like Israel, very successfully at a more global level. But it seems clearly designed that Malta wants to position itself there. Even the brand, Start in Malta, is sending a strong message. And I think that plays to some of our strengths as a jurisdiction and is less exposed to some of our vulnerabilities, whether it's access to labor force, whether it's access to certain capital flows. So I think it's a very interesting and it's a very logical play. And it's not just a statement of intent. We're clearly, investing. I think the minister spoke about 35 projects in 2021, which fell within the startup initiative, covering a total of 22 million. That's an average of 630,000 per project. I mean, that's material levels of support for a startup business. So I think this is a very interesting area. We're talking about the International Summit, EU Startup Summit, to attract European startups to Malta, and a high-caliber incubation center in addition to what Malta Enterprise is already managing at the Corradine. Business and Incubation Center. There seems to be a new plan around a further center. We have a digital innovation hub. Again, these are all supportive towards startups and towards the digitization of businesses and the assistance in developing, in transforming the business at technology level. I know Ludwig will go into some more details around that. But a strong focus, and even when you look at some of the benefits, startups are being identified as a special category. The final thing I'll mention in addition to that is there's a declaration of the intention to develop a plan, so I think we're a bit far away, but which will make Malta attractive to venture capital. I think that's very interesting. Of course, venture capital and startups have certain synergies between them. Of course, venture capital would not exclusively be focused at startups, but that's clearly this synergistic. And I think the strong focus then is around then when you see where the aid is coming, not through the tax measures, but through the cash grants. And we're talking about 40 million cash grants to small and medium-sized enterprises through Business Enhance. We're talking about 50% aid for companies investing in digital and sustainable projects, up to, of course, a cap of 100,000. So we're definitely seeing the focus around that area. And I think the other specific areas which are named are the gaming sector, with a focus on esports and video game development. And I know Ludwig will go into that. The film industry has been singled out. Shipping and aviation, with some references to a growing aviation register. Also the maritime sector with the work in the ports to accommodate, for larger vessels around the plans there to extend Malta's support to maintenance and repairs. I think the offshore renewable energy platform and the involvement of the private sector there is definitely a very interesting new area which, I think will be relevant. And of course, there's a lot of mention around waste management, and of course, waste management as well is something where I imagine the role of the private sector will become more relevant. So those are the areas which I feel come out of what the minister shared with us around his vision yesterday.
Thank you for that, Conrad. If we had to, I think you focused a lot on the technology aspect, and I think that came out very clear in the budget, that there's a strong focus on technology, digitization, and in fact, I wish to bring Ludwig into this. How do you see that materializing? What opportunities do you see from a technology and digitalization point of view? Obviously, it's something that was very relevant in the Recovery and Resilience Plan for Malta. It became even more relevant yesterday in the budget. So how do you see that translating?
Thanks, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to start off sort of emphasizing, we mentioned two key areas which will evolve eventually. We see evolvement and we will see investment in particularly esports and video game development. We know globally these are two specific sectors which are growing. There's a lot of movement, so I see the investment happening here is quite key in positioning Malta sort of in terms of industries which will continue growing and will position Malta quite strongly in the future. We'll need to understand a little bit more as well how does that play into sort of the labor market and sort of how we can sustain that, but obviously the direction I believe is the right one. What we've seen as well from an incentives perspective, again, they were mentioned. I think the incentives are there to help startups, but to also help existing SMEs. I believe the kind of incentive sort of is continuing from what there is already in place, but also sort of there's an increase over there. And essentially this helps businesses, SMEs out there to look for growth, to look at innovation, to become more operationally efficient. I do believe sort of with the incentives, they're not small, so I do believe that certain businesses can reinvent themselves, can look at the future, and can look at things like automation, disruptive technology, artificial intelligence comes into play, things like data analytics. I mean, all these things ultimately, when we look at transformation, they're key components essentially in helping businesses grow, helping businesses become more sustainable ultimately. So I do believe sort of from that perspective, we've seen, let's say, we're on the right track. In addition to that, we also mentioned the Digital Innovation Hub. Again, this is something being put in place. This will continue. In addition to incentives, it will also help SMEs out there sort of innovate themselves, sort of have an area where they can look within and sort of Sorry, I'll move on to the topic. Sure. Finally, as well, what we've seen is when we're looking the RRP, we mentioned the RRP, there's seen business enhanced schemes and also inward looking sort of digitization of government services. Particularly we've seen in e-health, the courts and the justice area, as well as the maritime and the transport mode.
Thanks, Ludwig. Maybe to shift slightly on the talent side now, and I'll bring in Caroline on the subject. I was mentioning in the introduction the challenges the country is facing even in an international context, but maybe coupled with that, Malta is also facing a challenge. Maybe some will look at it as a challenge in terms of full employment, which is of course eventually having an impact also on a wage inflation as well. Caroline, we saw a number of initiatives, whether it's in terms of social measures, education measures, training measures. What was your take of this budget in terms of the talent-related measures and recommendations?
Thanks, Andrea and Rachel, for having me this morning, and good morning, everyone. I think, as you've said, and what we've heard this morning, in terms of the reality of the talent market and unemployment at its lowest ever when compared to our counterparts in Europe, and what does this mean for Malta? If you ask any organization today, one of their biggest challenges is in fact the attraction of talent and recruitment, and that remains. And how has this budget and how does it plan to assist organizations in this respect? When we look at what in terms of opportunities, in terms of finding the right skills to be able to work in organizations, this remains to be a big challenge for organizations. So even in terms of, the budget spoke about the initiatives that it will be introducing in terms of the worker as well, and how will that actually make an impact. I think what possibly where I feel when we look at sort of the initiatives when we're talking about sort of the working, and even when we look at things like the work-life balance, for parents and carers, and the introduction of flexibility and hybrid working, and we look at areas specifically around the tension, if you like, between workers expecting that element of flexibility, expecting to have a better work-life balance. You look at Deloitte's report on the millennial survey and what the results were telling us there. combined with the, if you like, the businesses trying to ensure that the required talent is still there operating, ensuring the success of the business, it remains extremely challenging. And, you know, organizations this morning, local companies have woken up to say, okay, you know, the COLA adjustment, what does that do to my business in terms of the impact that that is going to have on my costs? And again, retaining and attracting people, and how does that continue to build my organization moving forward. So I think it is very interesting to see how that tension, I think, is going to be further accentuated as a result.
Absolutely. Caroline, if I may add, I feel, and there were some comments even in public, that this budget did not tackle the skills challenge enough. It does go into and mentioning the skills census that is being carried out, and that there will be also an audit of digital skills in the country. Do you feel it has gone far enough in terms of trying to, you know?
I think what the budget referred to, and even made the connection with the national workforce, the strategy that was rolled out now, so 2021 to 2030, the vision. I think the focus on the skills has been around rolling out the census, you know, getting a snapshot of what is Malta's skills capability today, what does it look like, and then a further step would be on the digital capability. Where I feel possibly there could have been more focus is around, okay, just how ready are we getting our future workers of tomorrow? And in fact, the policy does go into the future of work. What are those skill sets? When we speak about the capabilities we expect, I mean, we see it in our own organization today, you know, what are the capabilities that we expect to see? And then where the connection was made to that policy, that national workforce policy, which, interestingly enough, the objective was, okay, this is to improve the quality of the working life of Maltese individuals. This is our ultimate aim, to get to a better working, a better quality of life, and a more meaningful and impactful working life for our people. So what the correlation was especially focused on the migration, so rolling out of the migration policy, developing the digital platforms to make sure that we have the right tools to enable the migration cycle, you know, looking at different types of migration, looking at the data, what is the data telling government. On the skills, I feel that further could have been done, and a lot still remains to be done, because ultimately I believe that it is at the core that we need to be looking to make sure how well prepared are our future workforce, you know, how well are we equipping them with those skills that they're going to need. And that is something that should be done today, and I don't believe that, you know, a survey will tell us, you know, will give us that information that we don't already feel and see today. Most especially, you know, we've spoken about the digital and the impact of digital, artificial intelligence, so, and not just the technological skills, the human skills as well, which, you know, no technology is going to replace.
Absolutely. On this, what I liked was, and I like to see more of this across the board, when we're talking about video game development, and we're talking about the incubation center, which is now going live in Zaytoun, 700 square meters of incubator space, which I think the Minister projects will be filled and operational by the end of the year. It was premised by a statement that having trained specialized trainers who can give education to generate a workforce who can be competent, we can now move into that direction, and putting the education first in the plan, so developing the skill set so that we can then provide the human resource to fuel the business, the entrepreneurs who direct their capital, is a logical first step, and that was something very positive. And I'm sure it's things we've done in the past, but I would like to see us do more of that. And I think, you know, that's very welcome when I read that.
If I may, on this point, because we did get a question from the audience, and I think I'll direct this one to Rafel. What is the impact of this COLA increase, and how is it going to impact businesses, and how is it going to impact the economy?
It is the highest increase
Exactly.
in ages. And when you talk about 10 euros from the private sector, it's definitely quite a significant impact. If you talk about, that means on a 52-week basis, that's 500 euros per employee. If we put in context, obviously, if you're talking about profitable entities, okay, and you talk about an economy which is obviously sort of accelerating at a certain pace, I would say that the initial reaction would be see, yes, it is a manageable cost. But the reality is that we're not only looking at COLA increases, but we do have pressures on consumption. We do have spiraling inflation. Yes, contained to a certain degree with the measures taken on fuel costs, okay? But the reality is it's not, the business community as well is going through, in particular, obviously, imported costs are spiraling. Logistical issues are what they are. Property prices are, continuing to increase. Interest costs are likely to continue to increase. So I think if you just take the COLA increase over there, one would say if we do, and I think we do need to sort of commend the fact that both from the public sector and the private sector, I think we've withstood COVID, we've come out strong, we've rebounded, and I think in many respects we were sort of on the right trajectory. However, where we are now, with the pressures of, again, external pressures on the inflation and also obviously the realities that we have at the moment, COLA costs, challenging economic environment, spiraling inflation, and also supply chain challenges is not going to be easy. But I do believe that the Maltese business is resilient, okay? I think there is a tendency to sort of take the necessary measures and to come out stronger, and we have seen this through COVID. I think there have been a number of success stories where people sort of lived up to those challenges, and I think this is going to be 2023 is not going to be an easy year. There will be companies which might have to take corrective action, and I do think that there could be situations of mergers and other situations where people will look at trying not to go it alone or try to find alternative solutions over there.
In fact, I think another question was, is the solution going to be increasing prices and now we're going to be fighting even higher prices?
I think I think that there are people who will take that as the easy way out. Okay, you will continue. There are clear evidence. There have been a number of clear signs where I think it's passed the buck. There has been a situation where the costs have come in and actually passed them on to consumers, and sometimes at a profit. But I think that's short-sighted, and I think at the end of the day, a strategy where we simply try to pass all the costs to consumers when consumers are actually in a situation where they're facing challenges as well, because at the end of the day, the economy and people's income are finite. So at the end of the day, it cannot happen. And I think businesses need to think broader than simply increasing cost. I think, like we say, in many sectors, they need to look at ways of adding value. We often levy criticism on the public sector about being efficient in its costs, using technology to improve cost base. I think the private sector also needs to take the initiative in those areas to sort of rationalize their own operating business models. And if we do that, like is often the case, sometimes after a challenging period, we can come out stronger. We do have a history of doing it, okay? I think the secret is how long do it take to take the necessary measures? And I think both the public sector and the private sector need to ensure that they don't go for the easy way out, because that is short-sighted and will definitely backfire.
What I found interesting as well, Rafe, was that the Minister of Finance seems to have anticipated that logic and says to Maltese productive undertakings which operate in the local economy, this should be an opportunity for market penetration strategy, build brand, because you are not exposed to the same pricing pressures maybe which foreign imported goods are going to have to reflect on the pricing. And there was an interesting approach to think medium to long term, don't think short term. This is not an opportunity maybe to exploit, but it's an opportunity to convince and build a client base on products which maybe historically the consumer would have defaulted to products coming from overseas. And I thought that was an interesting tack on that.
I think this situation, the point you just mentioned, which is about the sort of try to reinvent yourself, try to turn the sort of what is a challenge into an opportunity. There are a lot of cases in the budget speech which refer. The feeling is, if only there was a bit more, if only it was more expanded. Now, the budget is not the be-all and end-all. Let's just hope that a number of the points which were mentioned in the budget, okay, as areas of opportunity, where we as a country, okay, can reinvent ourselves and look and sort of emulate a number of the successes we've had in the past. Let's hope and push for the momentum in these growth areas. If we don't take the present circumstances an opportunity to reinvest ourselves and to find these new opportunities where we can grow, then it would be, I don't think we will achieve much. But if we do take it as a situation that, you know what, we don't take things for granted, that we look at how we're really going to create or start taking on sowing the seeds today for what is going to give us medium and longer term reinventing ourselves, I think it would be a lost opportunity.
I agree, and I think if you also look at, okay, the budget, it results in a lot of increased costs for businesses, etc. I think when reinventing yourself, if you look at assistance which you can get from the government in grants and incentives, then that pushes you to be able to do more and get assistance to be able to do what you want to do. And I think that brings us into the kind of sustainability aspect which I'd like to pick up with Michael. Obviously, the budget focused a lot on sustainability measures, and it was something which was expected. I think it is the way forward, it is the future, particularly when it comes to transport, green transport, etc. What is your key takeaways?
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. So I think before jumping into the transportation itself, I'd like to sort of set out the landscape. And what you have is sustainability, ESG, so environment, social, governance principles are matters that are at the forefront of all discussions, both at the European level and also locally within companies. There's a lot of pressure by stakeholders in order to go green. So what does that mean? To think more about sustainability and the longevity of using natural resources, looking at reducing your waste, circular economy. So there are these driving principles which are coming through from a European level and actually a global level. You've got the SDGs, social development goals, sustainable development goals, sorry. And there are 17 of those from the United Nations, all of which are pushing down to changing mindsets. So as part of that process, if I had to sort of tap into the budget on transportation, what we find that the government is continuing to provide quite good incentives which are already existing. So you take the electric vehicles, for example. So if you have to buy an electric vehicle, you have the 11,000 grant, up to 12 if you scrap a vehicle, which is one of the best across the European Union in terms of incentivizing the purchase of such a vehicle. In so doing, the anticipation is that you play a part in reducing your carbon footprint. You also have other things that are, of course, to have an electric vehicle, you have to have equivalent number of charging ports. So at the moment, there are only about 340 ports across the islands of Malta and Gozo. The anticipation is to grow those significantly by 1,200 additional ports up to 2024, thereby allowing people more flexibility in finding the solutions to charging those vehicles. I mean, it's obviously fundamental, and the government is recognizing that via the budget. I think some areas which are quite interesting and worth mentioning are in relation to, this is a bit like thinking outside of the box and using the limited space that we have, for example, in providing underground parking spaces where at the moment you just have one level. So in urban areas where there is a parking area, the intention is to dig down, so to perform a study, to dig down, have underground parking areas with a garden covering all that. We see a good example of that in Floriana, for example. So you'd replicate that model across Malta, thereby reducing pressure over there. Another point worth mentioning is the rush hour traffic. I think it's a bee in everyone's bonnet. The fact that to get to work, the mounting traffic that there is. So we see a study that the government is sort of saying, let's have a study of the rush hour traffic. Let's think outside the box and let's find other ways of removing that pain point. So coming up with sort of delivery schedules and whatnot. Obviously, the detail hasn't been spelt out yet, but the direction of travel is there. What I could mention is also the fact that you have interest-free loans. So the government is also suggesting that there are interest-free loans provided to companies looking to change their fleet from carbon-emitting, so combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles, which, as we were saying before, with increasing inflation rates, increasing interest rates, etc., will obviously be a respite for many companies and quite attractive.
If I may add to what you just mentioned, Michael, you mentioned the issue of congestion, which is really and truly the biggest challenge in terms of mobility in this country. You don't feel that these recommendations and these measures were focused really and truly in shifting our fleet from an ICE-based fleet to basically to a more energy efficient fuel fleet? And really and truly, the issue of congestion hasn't sort of been skimmed through. You mentioned actually the study that will be carried out to start seeing the deliveries are not carried out during peak times. And there was also, of course, the measure introduced just before the budget in terms of the free public transport measure.
Absolutely.
Do you feel that this budget has gone far enough in terms of solving and trying to really address the issue in terms of the congestion problem in the country?
No, I think this is not. It's obviously just the starting off point. This is the tip of the iceberg. So there are a lot of the incentives that we have. What we need to do, I think, culturally, is change our mindset. That is fundamentally where we need to get to. In that, do we need to have one car per person in getting, to the office? Can we start a situation of carpooling? Can we start using bikes and electric bikes to get around? So I think these are things where the government can incentivize these approaches. However, it all boils down to what we want to do as individuals, among society in sort of making a better place. I suppose the fact that there is free transport that is now being offered is no excuse. So for those of us who can, but again, we need to see continued investment by the government in the infrastructure to make sure that if you are going to get onto the bus, if you are going to leave your keys at home and use the public transport, that you're going to get to where you need to get to on time. And this is, so the trust in the system is fundamental to its success as well. As you see, there was a trust in the system when it came to the grant being offered on electric vehicles, and until May, the hybrid vehicles, which was taken up substantially. So we have over 10,000 vehicles at the moment on the road, which are either hybrid or electric. So when we see schemes that work, they do work. And I think, as I said, this is the tip of the iceberg, so hopefully we'll see a lot more of these incentives to start changing mindsets.
If I may, I have a question which has come in, and I think there's two, actually, one for Conrad, and I'll direct one to Caroline. I think I'm going to put you on the spot here a bit. So I think the issue with sustainability and ESG at this point is that businesses don't feel like they need to go for it because there's no obligation as such at the moment, no strict regulations around what they need to do to adhere to certain ESG requirements. How can tax be used as a measure to address that?
So, I mean, tax obviously is a cost, like any other cost in a business, and it can drive behavior. So if tax is used either to incentivize or to penalize certain activity, then it's going to clearly influence that. So I think tax is one of the most powerful tools, especially if you look at the options the government has. You know, we don't have monetary policy because we form part of the euros, and so our fiscal policy instruments become tax. So it's definitely a very powerful tool. The question is, you know, is there the will to use it for that purpose, and what is the destination which we are looking to achieve, and how quickly are we looking to get there? And that's, I think, a function from a policy point of view. Definitely tax provides the options, it provides the levers. As Mike said, you know, if a scheme works and you offer a grant and people take it up, it's oversubscribed. It's the same with photovoltaic panels, it's the same with... The question then is, though, are we putting in the right schemes for the right outcomes? You know, and I mean, in the interest of just kind of reacting a little bit to what Michael was talking about, you know, I would like personally, and I'm not speaking from any position of great knowledge or expertise, but personally I would like to see more investment through schemes in incentivizing public transport use as opposed to more vehicles on the road. Of course, better to have an electric vehicle than a 20-year-old diesel engine, for sure, no argument on that, but the time will then come, I would hope, that the investment goes into saying, I reward you for using other means, and I penalize you now more if you're using those means which are causing a problem, whether it's congestion or whether but it's more than just saying it's free. I think, you know, a transport system has to be reliable, it has to be efficient, it has to cater for all weather conditions, and I think that's where we have weaknesses within our system. So I think it's easier said than done. But, you know, going back to tax can of course be a powerful tool.
On Conrad's point, I think the last point, I think it's fundamental, which is if there is an effective solution, okay, then it will work. 10 years ago, the use of taxis, cabs as an alternative over there, non-existent. The market, which is obviously over there, provided the solution, and the use is growing by the day. You have a situation, certain alternatives, bikes, again, you have a situation where there is an alternative, we will use it. I think tax as an incentive, as a facilitator, yes. But unless we have, be it the public transport, be it the, you know, you mentioned carpooling, unless these schemes are effective and efficient and sort of there's buy-in from all the stakeholders, the user, the employer, and the government in incentives, we will not change the culture. This is not an overnight thing, but the fundamental needs to be focusing on the solution. I think sometimes we try to give too much importance to the incentive, like we talk about your point about the 340 charges. Everybody, there are a lot of people who want to do it, and the reason they won't do it is because it is inefficient, because they're on those necessary charges. So at the end of the day, even in the commercial sector, the conversion needs to be complemented by an efficient means of charging those vehicles.
I think focusing on the users, and this is the question I was coming to with Caroline, what is the general feel in the workplace when it comes to ESG and being more sustainable? What are we seeing?
I think it's also, if we have to take from people, I think we are in a period where there is a lack of knowledge. We are still understanding what this means. I think when we speak about ESG, I think it means different things depending on the sectors you're dealing with and the sectors you are speaking to. I think the impact on the employees itself, and as we start to see the metrics and the numbers and the reporting obligations, that as well. So for me, I think it's at a very early stage, and even the importance that you know, the budget has focused on versus the knowledge and the information out there, I still think there's quite a gap. And a lot remains to be done in terms of information. And so whilst obviously within the companies that are impacted, there would be a higher level of knowledge. But I think in general, if you know, amongst forum where I would be discussing, there still is that sort of gap in understanding exactly what would the obligations be.
We mentioned the fact that you started off by saying there isn't regulation or legislation on the topic of ESG, and that at the moment holds true. But very, very shortly, I mean by 2024, what we're going to see is the implementation of the CSRD, which is a directive exactly targeting the regulation and the disclosure of sustainable measures. The CSRD is going to sort of gradually increase. So this is the corporate sustainability directive. It's going to, slowly increase. We start in 2024 with listed entities with more than 500 employees, and that will increase to large entities in 25, and then SMEs onwards in 26. So there is legislation out there. The data, as Caroline was mentioning, is a challenge. So I think it's important that whilst there is that lead time, especially possibly for the large and the SMEs, in sort of wait and see game, I think it's important that one starts to understand what data is going to be required of the entity when it comes to your footprint, both at a consumption of fossil fuels and natural resources, but also when it comes to your retention of talent. How do you train your people? How do you retain your people? What salary do you allow them? How do you benchmark that against the market, etc., etc. So these are all. It's a data-hungry directive. So I think thinking about the Malta turning into a digitalized hub and just picking on that is important. So thinking about, let's not look at this with the mindset we did. We sorted out the previous challenges 5-10 years ago. Let's sort of look at it with a new mindset and see how technology can help us quantum leap in getting that information effectively.
I think one of the biggest misconceptions there as well is that there's a lot of focus on what they say, the E and the S, the environment, the sustainability, and very little focus on other things like the governance, which is a huge part of ESG. And you've touched on a few points, so I agree there's a lot yet to be understood.
So, Michael, before we go to the concluding remarks, any further measures which have attracted your eye in terms of, for example, circular economy and sustainable development and even renewable energy?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there are some takeaways that I noticed from the budget. I think there are, in terms of the sustainability, let's say, right, or ESG, what you have is you've got a pillar on renewable energy, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then you've also got the concept of circular economy. So what you do in the life cycle of a product. And it's very important to contemplate that you don't sort of build something, have waste material and dump it somewhere. Now, that's not the end of that product. Or you have garments that you've utilized and then you throw them away. No, what you try and do is you try and find a second life, and then a third, and then a fourth of that, let me call it waste, in order to upcycle and to reuse those resources. So as part of that, it's good to see that the government has a multi-material recovery facility that is which is launching, in very shortly in 2023, as part of the Eco Hive. It's also interesting to note that they're investing in an organic processing plant, also with a mandate of about 60 million, according to yesterday's budget, and also a material recovery facility. So what does this all mean? These facilities are effectively there to gather the waste that is being consumed both at a commercial level and also at a household level, and use those, and instead of dumping them in landfills, but finding ways of utilizing that resource and bringing it back into the economy with a value add. So I think that is quite an important and positive spin. Now, does the private sector have a part to play in all this? Absolutely. So there is the positivity to it. The other thing worth mentioning is on renewable energy. So on renewable energy, as Conrad mentioned, there is the continued rollout of grants and incentives on the solar panels, your water heaters, heat pumps, etc. So that is nothing new. What's new and I find quite interesting is the offshore benefit. So here we're talking about, again, we're not left with much information other than the fact that they're performing studies in relation to offshore farms. Now that can be a wind farm, and it can be a floating solar power farm. Either way, we could make very good use of our seas, our shores, to generate such energy. And we can be a beacon at a European level in terms of the ratios of such electricity generation.
Okay. Ludwig, let me bring you in on this debate, because Michael mentioned specifically the lack of data and how technology can help in that respect in terms of ESGs. What is the role that digitalization and technology plays in terms of achieving these new goals in terms of environmental, social, and governance measures?
There are two aspects when it comes to sustainability, which I would go into. Sort of there's the platforms where you collect the data. I think the technology is already with us. There's a lot of platforms out there. There's a lot of technologies which can be utilized, which can be applied to collect the data. The other area which we're slowly, over the years, we've seen development is specifically IoT. IoT plays quite a key, important role in data collection. You could have things like sensors which measure air pollution, things around waste, around water, anything practically. This is continuously developing, hardware is continuously developing, and basically combining that with, let's say, the software, the technologies out there to collect that data is basically where we can capture that information, analyze that information, and based on that then take decisions where to improve, how to improve, what else should we be doing. That's basically, I think, the key aspect, basically how, from a sustainability perspective, we can evolve.
I think we can conclude here. The hour is up. I'd like to start off by thanking all our viewers for participating and for listening in on today's discussion. I'd like to thank our panelists for being here with us today. I also invite you to visit our Deloitte Malta page, be it on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and also on the web for more information. Thank you all very much and have a pleasant day.
Thank you.